So we don't often do this at Project Zook. This is a really special opportunity for Project Zook and for Hadar. Normally, Project Zook is a really asynchronous experience where you and your chavruta are studying these sources on your own. We designed the sources such that you can make your way through on your own. And usually there isn't much interaction with faculty, but there was so many people. There were so many people writing in, um, asking questions about the course, wanting to know um, if they could interact somehow with Rav Micha'el. And so I wrote to him, and I'm so grateful that Rav Micha'el was able to give us this evening with him for a Shoel Umeshiv. We really are privileged to have him here with us tonight. Rav Micha'el is faculty at Hadar. He received rabbinic ordination both from the chief rabbinate in Israel and from his teacher, Rav Elisha Anselovitz. He also holds a PhD in Talmud and rabbinics from JTS. Micha'el has served as an associate professor of rabbinics at Hebrew College in Boston and as the rabbi of the Fort Tryon Jewish Center in Washington Heights. He is the co-author of two books, Signs of Virginity, Testing Virgins and Making Men in Late Antiquity. And he co-authored with Rabbi Ethan Tucker, Gender Equality and Prayer in Jewish Law. We're so honored to have Rav Micha'el. I'm gonna shoot 3 questions at you now, and you can take your time to answer each one. Okay. So let's start with this one. Can you describe the process of selecting these texts? How did you decide which portions of the text to omit and which ones to include? There's a question specifically from session 2. Why did Rav and Rava say Barzilai Hagiladi was promiscuous and a liar? When we get to that, I'm happy to bring up that text actually on the screen. You just let me know, Rav Micha'el. And then final question here is, an old etrog is okay for ritual use, according to that source in the last source sheet, but that was a minority opinion. Has there been any continuation of this discussion about an old etrog and whether it's kasher? So go ahead and let me know if you need any sources on the screen.
Great, thank you so much. I think I'm okay, at least for this round, with not pulling up the sources, but it might be, if we think it'd be helpful for folks to have it in front of them, that's also great. Great opening question of how did I decide what to include? It was actually, as you can imagine, quite difficult. There is a ton of material about aging in rabbinic literature. It was one of these things where I was interested in the topic for all sorts of reasons. I shared a bit about that in the videos. And I had some places where I wanted to begin looking. And once I got into it, it was overwhelming, actually. And so I started thinking more about what are the themes that I wanted to pull out rather than what are the texts that I want to share. Certainly there was, I could have brought a lot more on the theme of aging as a difficult stage of life. That second session, as you would imagine, there's quite a bit there. But I didn't feel the need to sort of, just overwhelm us with sources that are all saying the same thing. And I really wanted to pull out some of the more ambiguous and also more positive views of aging as well. So that was really where I went with that. I was also very fortunate. There are actually a number of academic books that have been written in recent years about old age in rabbinic literature. And so I was very fortunate to be able to make use of those. One in particular by, I'll put this actually in the chat, the names of these authors, Mira Ballberg and Chaim Weiss. The title of the book is actually escaping me right now, but it's something like Aging in Rabbinic Literature. Oh, no, it's not actually. It is When Far Becomes Near. That's the name of the book. When Far Becomes Near. No, sorry, When Near Becomes Far. When Near Becomes Far. Oh, and look at that. We even have a link. And then there's a chapter by a scholar named Jonathan Wynne Schofer. The book is called Confronting Vulnerability, which is not about old age. It's about, as its name implies, vulnerability in rabbinic literature, but there's a chapter there on aging. So I was very fortunate to also benefit from the work of scholars who've written before me to sort of, there were things in there that I didn't feel were as relevant, but I was definitely very influenced by those two works in particular. From the sort of broad question of how did I think about what sources to include, one very specific question. If you'll recall from session 2, Barzillai in the Tanakh, in the Bible, says that he's old and therefore he can no longer discern between good and bad. And this gets attacked by these two rabbis, one saying he's a liar, and the other saying he was promiscuous. And those are both attempts to say, even though it might seem from this passage in the Tanakh, in the Bible, that old age is a time when you sort of lose your discernment, that is in fact not the case. The one who calls him a liar saying, look, we know a story of this 90-year-old woman in Rebbe's house. Oh my, amazing. Right? Rob said Barzillai Gileadite was a liar. You can scroll down just a bit, Rav Kayla. Great. For there was a certain Rebbe's house who was 90 years old and she would taste the dishes. So, this is kind of if we're trying to make a logical argument here, there's a bit of a ridiculous point, right? The fact that, my father of blessed memory was not a strong person in his old age, and someone else in the room that might have had a parent in their old age or who was like vigorous until the very end at 95 or whatever, does not disprove, those are both real experiences. But I think Rav is not trying to make a logical argument here, but a rhetorical one. He's trying to say, don't tell me that old age is this time of diminished abilities. We know that there are people who actually maintain their ability, in this case, to taste food. And likewise, Rava comes along and says, well, there's actually a reason why Barzillai lost his sense of taste in old age. It's not because he was old, it's because he was sexually immoral. And they have this tradition. And do they really have this tradition, or are they just saying this in order to make the point? I think probably the latter, that sexual immorality leads to old age being a time of increasing difficulty. So what this ends up being is one way of understanding why do some people suffer in old age. Oh, those people must have been problematic. I just said about my own father that his old age was not one of great vigor, and I certainly would not say that that's because he was particularly immoral in any realm of law. Would not want to cast that aspersion on him. But you can understand why, if we're sort of debating how should we think about old age, right? Rava seems to be on the side saying, no, old age is actually a time that could be a time of great vigor. And I can explain away why someone might not have that kind of vigor in old age. So I think that's what's going on with Rav and Rava there. And then I forgot to write down the third question. Rav Kayla, could you remind me what it was?
Yes, this is about the old etrog.
Right.
Has the discussion about that continued since Muriel was totally on point. This is a minority opinion I think it was Rav Yehuda.
Yep.
I can't remember. Yeah.
I believe that's right. Yeah.
Who says an old etrog is kosher. You can use it. So the question is, has there been any continuation of this discussion?
Great. So I will say I was so interested, that source is generally understood as a sort of technical halachic source. And I got excited about it when 2 summers ago, one of our Roshei Yeshiva at Hadar, one of our the heads of the yeshiva, Rav Aviva Richman, taught to the faculty a session reading that passage as being about old age. That's where the idea came from. The excerpt you have actually is from Rav Aviva's piece in the High Holiday Reader from last year, and I definitely encourage folks. You can see it online on the Hadar website. If you search for High Holiday Reader, whatever year it is, it says on the source sheet what year it was. You can see the whole piece there. I am embarrassed to admit that I don't remember offhand how the halachic piece of this argument ends up falling out. I assume, both because in practice this is what I've always done, and because, as Muriel points out, it's a minority opinion there, that we don't follow that view, and that in fact you cannot use a dried out etrog on Sukkot. But to be honest, it's been a while since it's been 2 years since I've learned that sugya, that passage, for its halachic purposes. And for the last 2 years, I've really been focusing on it as in this way that Rav Aviva has taught it, as sort of metaphor for thinking about age. So I don't remember the details of that in terms of how that plays out. There may be some of that in Rav Aviva's piece in the High Holiday Reader, but I apologize, I don't have the answer at my fingertips in terms of halachically how that plays out.
I'm inclined to have, an etrog that is young in my sukkah this year, and also an old one. We like to keep the old ones in our house because they have that beautiful kind of perfume. So maybe for for the sake of what we learn here, I'll have both in my sukkah this year.
Beautiful.
Okay, so we have some more questions. Ashira is asking in the Talmud, Shabbat 152b. I can't remember which source sheet this comes from, so I'd love to bring it up. Maybe you know,
Probably
Ashira.
two.
Probably two. Why might the rabbis believe that a foolish person would become even more foolish with age? Is that simply a matter of parallelism with the text from Eov? So I can bring up that text from the same source sheet, I suppose. I'll do that in a moment. Gail is asking about session 3. How does silver gold compare? How does the silver gold comparison apply to learning and wisdom?
Yeah.
And Sarah and Joel are asking, thinking of age in terms of numbers. Today, old is 70, 80, 90. What was actually old age in terms of chronological age at the times when these texts were written? Really interesting. So we can start with a Shira's question, or whichever question you'd like to start with, and I can pull up the text.
Yeah, I think if you could just pull up that first text, I'm going to do it in reverse order, but it'll be good to have that on the screen once we get there. In terms of what was old age, as folks would imagine, well, I shouldn't say it quite like that. I think I mentioned this in one of the videos, that the Rif, Rav Yitzchak Alfasi, at least according to tradition, and I don't see any reason to doubt this tradition, lived to be somewhere between 90 and 100 years old. So there were, of course, always exceptions to the rule. But I will say that one of the insights that I got when I taught this material, we every year at Hadar run a rabbinic yeshiva intensive when rabbis from all sorts of denominations, all kinds of rabbinic work, come and study at Hadar for a week. And I taught some of this material at that rabbinic yeshiva intensive. And we were learning this material, the material from source, the source in Shabbat in session 2. And, it talks about the signs of old age, digestion starts to go, your seeing starts to go, it gets harder to sort of walk over small hills. And one of the students in that class pointed out, this doesn't sound like what we would call old age. This sounds like middle age to me. And I will say, as someone who is like smack dab in the middle of middle age right now, I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly right. Like, I remember when I was a kid being like, oh, why are my parents always cracking about their digestion? Oh, you can't eat this, I can't eat that. And now I'm in my mid 40s, and I am definitely at the point where, like, oh my gosh, I can't eat broccoli after 6 p.m. And I have not yet had, I've been nearsighted since I was 6 years old. I've not yet had the reading glasses, but my friends who are my age or just a little bit older are starting to buy reading glasses for the first time. And so I do think there's something interesting there, that in a course on aging, a lot, and I always take for granted that they were describing old age. There's certainly not pleasant things that they're describing, but a lot of that maps onto what we in the year 2024 would call middle age. And so that does make me think that, what they're really describing as old age is really sort of people in their 50s. And part of what motivated me originally in this course, as I think I said in the first video, is the recognition that old age is older, longer, and more common than it ever was before. So I think that's definitely, I think for them, old age was much more what we would think of as middle age than what we would think of as true old age nowadays. And there were always exceptions, right? It wasn't unheard of for someone to be, I mean, as we just saw in that source about Rebbe's maidservant, she was a 90-year-old in Rebbe's house. So, it's not as if what we would think of as old age was completely foreign to them. It just wasn't the default. In terms of the silver and gold, that's another really fascinating one, where when I put that source into these source sheets, the actual content there was, I thought, uninteresting, or at least uninteresting for these purposes, right? It's just a halakhic debate. It's actually about currency law. If any of you are currency traders, then it's very interesting. But if you're not a currency trader, probably not that interesting. And the real interest to me for the purpose of thinking about aging was Rebbe's son saying, I'm gonna reject what you're telling me now in your old age, and I'm gonna go with what you said when you were younger. But this is now the second time in less than a month that someone has said, well, actually, maybe it's not a random place for them to put this conversation, right? Something about silver and gold, the relationship between silver and gold, maybe that does map onto our thinking about youth and old age. I think it is a super interesting way to think about it. I don't generally think that conversations like this historically happened. I think it's much more likely that the editors of in this case, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud of the land of Israel, are looking for a place to put this conversation. And with that in mind, yeah, it may be that they're actually thinking about silver and gold as somehow mapping onto these notions of old age and youth. I don't have a sort of read on what that would be, but it sounds like the person who asked the question might. And finally, the source from Shabbat about a foolish person getting foolisher with old age. Yeah, I don't know. I actually hadn't really thought that deeply about that piece of it. I will say, I think for me, speaking very personally, the sort of most tragic moments of sort of old age where it gets in the way of one's cognitive abilities are when someone has not been a fool, right? When I have a very dear uncle now of blessed memory who was an amazing person. He was this sort of, he read widely, he was interested in Jewish learning, he read beyond Jewish learning, and he had Alzheimer's or some kind of dementia towards the end of his life. And I think that made it more difficult because it was this such a radical change. So I think that, I wonder if in that source, maybe what they're trying, often we say things that we want to be true, whether or not we really think they're true. And so something about like maybe, the foolishness, that it increases as you get older. There's also obviously an element of rabbinic self-preservation here, right? That, don't think that the rabbis, they're going to sort of become cognitively impaired as they get older. There, of course, they get more and more wise. And I would say the last thing about that is, I think there is an attempt again to understand the diversity of aging, right? That, it is easy to sort of fall in the trap of like old age is a time of weakness, old age is a time of wisdom. But actually, old age is a time of wisdom and foolishness. Old age is a time of weakness and vigor. And I mean that both in the sense of there are ways in which we get wiser and more foolish as we get old. And as I said before, different people's experience of aging really varies so widely. So I think that's part of what's really going on there, is just an attempt to understand the diversity of aging.
Thank you. I know a number of people have come into the room since Rav Micha'el has started answering questions. I just wanted to invite anyone who's come into the Zoom to leave your questions. We have a Q&A feature. So at the bottom of your Zoom window, you should have a button that says Q&A with a question mark. If it's not readily visible, it might be under more, the ... button. So you can click there and please submit your questions about anything that came up for you as you were studying these sources. I'm going to, Ashira, we just answered Ashira's question, and we'll come back to a second question from Ashira, but I wanted to give a chance for the questions coming from, I also see that there's a few questions in the chat, and we will certainly get to those. These questions come from Paula, Perlman, Bert, and Rena. So Rav Micha'el, I'll start with Rena's question. She says, our shul is studying the Stug course as a group, and a discussion came up last night regarding aging versus maturity in rabbinic literature. Are they the same or are they different? And is one more deserving of respect than another? Interesting question about aging versus maturity. Then we have a question from Bert. Can you contrast the ideas of, again, interesting contrast between growing old and aging? And yeah, that's an interesting question. And then we have from Paula, I remember this source too. I was bothered with the son not being able to accept that his father changed his mind in his old age, which seemed to miss the point that people can gain wisdom with age. Can you discuss the context for this? If someone could remind me real quick which source sheet that was in, maybe even Rav Micha'el, you know,
Yeah, so
the source about the sun.
that I believe was source sheet number 3.
Okay.
And actually, I think the other source that I want to reference that wasn't referenced by you, but I'd like to come back to is also in source sheet 3. So we'll be living in that source sheet for this round of questions.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll do these in reverse order as well. There are some folks in this chat who were with us actually for our July learning seminar just a couple weeks ago, who we had some selections from the zoo course that we learned together. And there was an amazing conversation when we got to that source about Rebbe and his son, right? This is the one, it was referenced earlier, the silver and gold, where Rebbe teaches something. Rebbe's son teaches something, and Rebbe says, no, teach it the exact opposite of how you taught it. And the son says, well, what do you mean when I was a kid? And I don't think he means a kid, I think he means a young man. You taught it to me the other way. I'm not going to change my mind. And we had such an interesting debate about, is this sort of a violation of kibbutz, the aim of respecting one's parents, sort of not listen to the father now when he wants to change his mind? Is this a kind of sadness on the part of the son of like feeling like, oh, actually my father's not who he used to be. Maybe he's seeing mental decline, which I don't think is actually implied in that source, but we could read it that way. Is it a question of, sometimes when our parents change their opinions or change their values, that's very hard for us. I think I gave this example. This will be familiar to the folks who were with us for July Learning Seminar. My teacher, Rav Elisha Anshelovich, who was mentioned in my bio, I studied the laws of Shabbat with him. And since I studied with him, he has completely changed his opinion about how the laws of Shabbat should be taught. And so now, and I still agree with how he taught it to me when he, 20 years ago, but now he actually says something that's almost the opposite of what I say about Shabbat. And is that sort of respecting my teacher because I'm teaching what he taught me? Or is that disrespecting my teacher because I'm not listening to what he says now? Whenever I actually teach laws of Shabbat, I have to say, I want you to know everything I'm telling you is not my own insight. Everything I'm telling you are insights from my teacher, and he disagreed with everything I'm about to say. And that's sort of my way of navigating that. But like that might also be what's going on here. Is like, it's not even necessarily about aging so much as like the child's perception of the parent. And, think about if some of you might have parents who've changed religiously over the course of their lives. Maybe they became more traditionally observant in their old age or less traditionally observant in their old age or changed their theologies. And maybe that was hard for you. So I think that also might be part of what's going on there with Rebbe and his son. In terms of the two questions about growing old versus aging or aging versus maturity, what's worthy of respect? Micha'el, if you could pull up, I think it should be on source sheet number 2, a source from Kiddushin. It's going to have, what I'm trying to remember what some keywords there might be to pull it up. Well, while we're talking, I'll say that, that source really gets into the question of, is sort of aging something that's worthy of respect on its own? Or is it simply the fact that, is it simply the fact that of old age that makes you worthy of respect? Or is it the wisdom and perhaps righteousness that comes with aging that makes you worthy of respect? So maybe I have the wrong source sheet. Maybe it's on source. Yeah, I think it's on source sheet number 3. But in any event, so I think that source, if you want to go, I would say both these questions about aging versus maturity, growing old versus aging. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Right. Right. So our rabbis taught you shall rise before the aged and show deference to the old. Could it be that this is so even before an elder who is unlearned or wicked, ashamai? And importantly, there's actually some ambiguity in the medieval commentators about what does ashamai mean? Does ashamai mean not, doesn't mean wicked? Does it mean unlearned? And they sort of play out these different opinions here. So I would say actually, if the conversation that you're having is around, is it aging or maturity that makes one worthy of respect, I would really come back to this source in Kiddushin. I think for me, that's a central source where the rabbis are really trying to argue this out of, and I think both sides make sense, right? There's something just sort of amazing about someone who's really achieved ripe old age, even if they're not the wisest person, if they're not the most learned person, if they're not the most righteous person. And on the other hand, really, maybe the real value is in those who might even be young, but have the wisdom of the old. So I'd say that this is a source that I would lean into and sort of really flush it out back and forth. What are the different opinions that we have here?
Great. Okay, I'm going to stop the share here. If anyone has come in since Rev Micha'el has been answering questions, just a reminder that you can add your questions to the Q&A button. And I know there are some also in the chat that I'll be looking at. Okay. 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 This one comes from Hillary. She was feeling disturbed about the discussion questions, which seem to paint a binary between youth and aging, and the image of aging as being about losing mental faculties. She says, would have liked more about older people, like the 90-year-old who still tasted the food.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way of reframing aging, perhaps? I'd be really interested in how these themes might play out in our literature. Much more to say. So a question about the binary between, or, being uncomfortable with the binary of youth and old age. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
From session 2, we have a question from Ilana. The Kohelet passage. The text seems to assume that the reader will know what the Chevel Kesef, that snaps, refers to, or the Gulat Zahav. Are there some specifics behind those references? I'll have to pull that up in session 2. Oh, okay. And here's a third question. Are there any rabbinic discussions about the idea of an old soul or someone wiser than their years?
Okay, so I'm going to take this in the order 3, 1, 2, so that by
3, 1,
the time
2.
we get to the
Right.
last one, we can have that.
We can pull up the source. Yes.
For the Kohelet, we're going to have that source in front of us. That's a very specific question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the idea. I'm trying to remember. I did not include. Just nod your head yes or shake a nose. I don't think I included a source about Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah becoming the head of the academy. Did I? Okay, great. So one of the sources, someone asked the first question about how did I decide what to include and what not to include. This was a source that I was very sad to leave on the cutting room floor, but I decided it didn't work with the sort of broader structure of the course. This is a text that's actually relatively famous. I mean, obviously no rabbinic story is truly famous, but to the extent that a rabbinic story is famous, this is probably a top 5 rabbinic story where the leader of the academy, Rabban Gamliel, has greatly offended sort of the most respected member of the academy, Rabbi Yeshua. And so the rabbis in the academy basically depose Rabban Gamliel, and they now need to replace him. They need to find a new person to be the Nasi, the leader of the academy. And after going through a number of different options, none of which will work for various reasons, it's kind of like the Veep stakes. Everyone's got some flaw that makes them not the right person. Maybe too relevant. Shouldn't have used that example. They land on Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And they say Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he's got it all, right? He's got wealth, so that if he has to go bribe the Romans, he can bribe the Romans, because that was one of the roles of the leader of the academy. They say he's got his ancestors, not only is he righteous, but his ancestors are righteous, because when you rule for the people, if you make a mistake, like that's a very big deal. And no one person's merit is enough to deal with the possibility of making mistakes. So you need to have ancestral merit as well to back you up. And he is learned, and he will actually know what he's doing. So he's got it all. The only problem, they say, is that he's too young. And people won't take him seriously because he looks too young. And so what happens? A miracle occurs, and overnight, he was completely white-haired, right? He had like a beautiful shock of black hair. Doesn't say black, but like whatever color hair his was. And then overnight, he goes completely white, so he looks old. And I think what that text is saying, actually, is that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is an old soul. This source actually gets sort of alluded to kind of, well, in a little bit of a backwards way in the Haggadah, right? If you remember the line at the beginning of the Haggadah when it says, Harei ani keven shivim shana v'lo zachisi shete'amer. I'm like 70 years old. I'm about 70, and I never understood the following thing that then goes on to say. So that line gets understood that I gotta say, what does it mean that he's like 70? He's actually, I think he's 17, if I remember correctly. But God makes him go totally white so that he looks 70, so that he can actually function in that way. I think that story, I think it's like brachot. It's attractive brachot of the Babylonian Talmud. I'm going to put it, I think it's 28a, but it's somewhere around there. Ashira actually studied that text with me many, many years ago. So you can take a look there. I think that story really, that's the one that comes to mind of an old soul. The binary between youth and age, and I'm so grateful for that question. Because yeah, I mean, this was one of these things of like, my goal in this course was to break down that binary. And I hope I did that with the selection of sources that I brought. But I think the nature of the guiding questions often is to sort of set things up in a binary to help people see things that they wouldn't see otherwise. And actually, ironically, by asking things in a binary way, to break them out of that binary. I don't know if that succeeded, but that was definitely the goal. And what I really hope folks see, in session 2, we really have these sources that sort of view aging in a very negative way, right? All these bad things happen to you, digestion starts to go, eyesight starts to go, even the cognitive faculties start to go. Session 4 was really focused all on the sort of beauty of aging, right? Beauty as aging as a blessing, aging as beauty. And session 3, which officially was focused on the question of learning and aging, but really I think that's the session where we sort of see this blurring of it, right? On the one hand, we have this model of old age as a time of increased wisdom, and then the other, old age as a time of decreasing mental faculties, and both of those things are true. So I hope the sources actually do break down that binary. That was definitely very much my goal. And I totally hear what you're saying about the guiding questions, that my goal with them is to sort of, by asking them in a binary way, help you see that things don't fit neatly into that binary. Whether that was successful or not, I leave for you to decide. We had that very specific question about Kohelet. So Rav Kayla, if you could pull that up. I am not remembering the details. So
can you see this?
Yeah.
So this is actually the original. This is from the Kohelet, and from Kohelet, and then the Talmud on this is in the next source sheet. So the verses themselves are here. This is the verse that Ilana was curious about. The text seems to assume that the reader will know that the Chavel HaKesef that snaps what the Chavel HaKesef that snaps refers to, or the Gulat HaZahav. Are there some specifics behind those references? And let me know if it would be helpful to also see the Talmud passage.
Great. No, I think that's sufficient. Thank you, Rav Kayla. Yeah. Kohelet Ecclesiastes is a very opaque text. It is not the most opaque. It is not the book of Job, thank God. But it's, it's like, if I were ranking the top 5 or top 10 opaque books of the Bible, I would put this somewhere between 5 and 10, I think. So I, and sometimes that opacity comes from the fact that there's a cultural reference that we no longer have. I did not see, when I looked at biblical scholarship on this, I did not see like a sort of widespread, like there's a specific thing that silver cord or golden bowl is referring to. I think more the idea of just although it's interesting actually, I never would have thought of this, but since we earlier had a question about the silver and gold in that passage from the Yerushalmi, from the Talmud of the Land of Israel, I don't know. Maybe there's something there. Maybe there's a way in which the editors of the Yerushalmi are trying to allude to this line. But I think that I understood this more generally as, like something beautiful that crashes, right? And old age can be understood as like, again, there's both the beautiful and the challenging of old age. And this passage from Kohelet is very much focused on the challenges of old age. And yeah, like something beautiful that sort of has been broken, maybe even ruined. So I think that's probably what's going on. I did not see, there's a lot of academic biblical scholarship on the book of Kohelet, on the book of Ecclesiastes. I by no means exhausted that scholarship. So I would not be surprised if there's someone who speculates about a more specific cultural reference there, but I did not come across anyone sort of naming a specific cultural reference for that.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have 2 more questions remaining in the Q&A section, and then I'm going to turn to the chat. I want to ask Jane's question. Oh, actually, I see there may be a third, actually. So there's a question from Jane. The aging of Abraham doesn't seem to parallel the suffering of Yitzchak. This is from Final Midrash, I believe, in it must be the fourth source sheet. The aging of Abraham doesn't seem to parallel the suffering of Yitzchak and the illness of Yaakov. How do we understand old age in relation to the other two, suffering and illness? Then we have the second question from Ashira that I was saving in Mishnah Avot 420. Rav Yossi Bar Rabbi Yehuda of Kfar says that learning from children is like eating sour grapes and drinking unaged wine. That seems awfully negative, an awfully negative view of learning from children. And how can we reconcile this with the idea that we learn sometimes the most from our students, as the rabbis tell us? So how do you square that? And there's just a general question about, rather than just describing old age, are there texts on how to make old age more meaningful?
Great.
So I'm happy to bring up the text Jane was referring to, that midrash. Would that be helpful? And then we can
that midrash I know very well. I'm happy to talk about that without that pulled up. If other folks want that up, that's totally great. I'm going to want to see the text of that Avot text just to make sure I get the exact wording in the Hebrew right.
Okay, so I'll go look for that.
Right.
And
I think that's probably gonna be the beginning of source sheet number 3.
Okay.
So in terms of the Avram and Yitzchak midrash, the Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, that I think I might have even said this either in the framing on the source sheet or in the video that for that session. That's one of my favorite midrashim. That midrash was the one that really got me off and running thinking about aging in rabbinic literature. And I totally hear what you're saying, right? It's like it's not totally clear what old age means in this midrash. But it would seem to me, it's pretty clear, right, that what we're talking about is the physical appearance of old age, right? Gray hair, wrinkles, maybe an arched back. And that, there are definitely people who are sad when their hair goes white, but there are also people who are like, oh, I'm excited that my hair goes white. I think it looks nice. It's not suffering in the same way that, Yitzchak's suffering is Yaakov's illnesses. What's amazing to me about this midrash is that even though one of these things is at worst ambiguous, and maybe even an unambiguous good, right? The appearance of old age, and the other two would seem to be very negative, right? Suffering and illness, all three of them are viewed as gifts from God, right? And this piece of old age that that many of us either experience ourselves as we are aging or experienced our parents as they're going through aging. I'll to speak very personally, when my father was, my father had a very typical for the year 2024 kind of experience of aging. He was basically doing fine. He hit 80, but he was he was a Holocaust survivor, and his health was always like the health of someone 5 to 10 years older than he actually was. And he hit 80, and all of a sudden, like, things got really rough, and he had about 3 years of really being in and out of the hospital a lot, just really not being functional the way that he had been before. And then he passed away at 83. And that last year in particular, I was living in Boston at the time. My parents lived in New York, and I had to leave Boston twice on sort of short notice to go because we thought it was the end. And if I'm being fully honest, I hated that. It was so miserable. I hated it emotionally. I hated it practically. And it meant I knew the end was coming, and I could ask him things and he could share things. My father's a particularly not eager to share things kind of person. So even in that last year, it's not like I got tons of stories, but I got a little more than I would have had the end been more sudden. And so I think what's amazing about this midrash is that you're right, the signs of old age and suffering are totally different from each other, and yet they're both gifts, right? They're both actually, even though those parts of old age that we think of as the negatives of old age, there's a reason why they're really there as a blessing. I'll come to let's go to the passage from Avot. So we have here Elisha ben Avuya Omer, actually interesting figure, Elisha ben Avuya, but we can actually scroll up just a little bit. Great. Just scroll up a little bit more. I can't see the top there. Perfect. Halomed Yeled. Sorry. Halomed Yeled Lamau. So if you learn as a child, what's that like? That's great because like there's ink on new parchment. That's very clear and very easy to read. Right, but Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Ish Kfar Habavli, but Rabbi Yossi with this long name says Halomed Minaktanim L'Maudomeh La'ochal Navim Kehos Vishose Yain Megito. Right, so learning from children, Minaktanim. Now, I could play around with that word ktanim a bit, right? Ktanim here, I think pshat. I think the contextual meaning probably is exactly as, was this a Shira who asked this question? Yeah. I think pshat here is probably exactly as Ashira said it, and as we have the translation here, learning from children. And I hear that's very negative, and we certainly have an idea also from Pirkei Avos, well, kind of from Pirkei Avos, that learning from your students is like where you learn the most. That is certainly my experience. Although students don't necessarily have to be young. And there's a way which that's at odds with each other. And I do think there's something about, I have had some students who are lightning smart and lightning fast, and they can learn a passage in the Gemara, even though they're my students, so much faster than I am and with much more precision than I have, right? Like the fact that I'm the teacher of their student does not mean that they know less than I do, right? They might know as much as I do, but sometimes what happens, if it's like again, I don't want to get into this sort of binary of like youth is foolish and old age is wise, but there have been moments where like I'll have a young student who like sees something, but they're not really able to sort of slow down and sort of see all the aspects of something, not able to see like how this plays out in real life. They just have less experience. And so I think there's a way in which, often when we make rhetorical claims, we make them too strongly, right? If we're taking them seriously as like, as literal claims. And I don't think that, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda of Kfar Bavli, I don't think he's really saying that you never learn anything from a child, but I do think he might be saying, don't get so impressed with that child prodigy, right? That person comes along and can rattle off all of the Talmud by heart at the age of 12, which there are such people in the world. Like, don't assume that because they can rattle off the Talmud by heart at the age of 12, that they're actually deep and wise. They might be, but we can't assume that. I think too often we sort of value the prodigy more than we value the person who sort of gets to a place slowly and methodically. Before I was a Talmud teacher, I was a serious violinist, and there's actually sort of parallels there, right? That's a world where, there are often people who make their solo performance with an orchestra at the age of 6. But sometimes, if you listen to, for example, Sarah Chang, recordings of her from when she was 10 or 12, which we have, and recordings of her from, when she's an adult, like there's a depth to the performance when she's older that you don't have when she's 10 or 12, even if it's more impressive in some way when she's 10 or 12. Right, and then the final question here was, are there texts about making old age more meaningful? That is a great question. For this Zug course, I really focused on rabbinic literature. The first session was on Bible, because you can't really understand what the rabbis are thinking without knowing the kinds of texts that they were inheriting. But fundamentally, I was interested in what do the rabbis of the classic Talmudic period from roughly 100 to like 600 CE, what do they say? And in that literature, that kind of question gets addressed, if it gets addressed at all, implicitly. There's not usually a sort of taking on of like, well, how do you make your religious life more meaningful, right? The rabbis talk about that by just saying like, here's what you should do, right? They don't say like, here's what you do to make it more meaningful. They just say like, here's what you do. And the idea is that if you do the things, then it will be meaningful. I think that's the way classically the rabbis speak about it. I'm working now actually on a lecture series for the fall about anger in the Jewish tradition. And that's going to be not limited to classical rabbinic texts, but sort of the span of Jewish literature. And the last session there is going to be, the first 2 sessions are about, thinking about anger in sort of the abstract, right? Is anger a good thing? Can anger ever be a good thing? And the last session is a session on, well, for those times when anger is a bad thing, how do we deal with our anger? And I really have struggled to find anything, not anything. There are a few sources that I have, but for the most part, the sources I'm looking at are 18th and 19th and 20th century Hasidic sources. They sort of get to this question of like, well, how do I actually manage this on the personal level? I think you would see a similar thing with aging. I didn't do this work with aging. I haven't looked at more recent Jewish texts about aging. But I suspect that there may be, both in Hasidic and other more recent Jewish literatures, that might be the place to look for something like, how do we think about making our aging more meaningful? But I didn't really see that kind of thing in the classical rabbinic sources, and I wasn't surprised not to find that sort of thing.
Thank you. We just have a few more questions that I looked at in the chat, and they actually kind of shared the same tenor. And so I'm going to share it just as our last question, and then I'm going to open it up for you, Rav Micha'el, if you want to share any closing thoughts before we close the Shoel Umeshiv. It has to do with kind of the tone of the text. And there was a general feeling that more texts than not leaned into the hardship of aging and frankly the negative aspects of aging, as opposed to the gifts, the joy, what you actually gain in aging rather than what you lose. So how do you think about that? How did you think about kind of the tone of the sources that you were bringing, the kind of message you wanted to bring, especially keeping in mind the different kinds of people who are coming to this rabbinic literature, someone like you and me versus someone who might be living in an older body?
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's, it's a great question to end with, because I think it really, like, that's in some ways I don't know, is it too out of date to say the $64,000 question? Yeah, I totally hear that. And I'll say one apologetic, one defensive thing, and one more open thing. The apologetic, I will say, is that part of that sense that we have more negative text than positive text in this Project Zoo course, I think comes from the fact that one of the 4 sessions is focused on aging in the Bible. And I did not really see much, if anything, in the Bible that was sort of, you get that notion of like a ripe old age, right? Seva tova, good old age. But there, it doesn't seem like what they're saying is that the quality of the old age is good, but rather just like the fact that you got to this old age is amazing, right? Like most people don't do that in antiquity. I think the Bible definitely has a sort of more negative attitude. And because I gave a whole session over to biblical passages, that already biases us, right? We've got sort of 25% of the course is more negative. And then when we get to the 3 sessions on rabbinic literature, which is really my passion and my expertise, again, I tried to have one session that was more negative. That was session number 2. One session that was more positive. That's session number 4. And one session that was more ambiguous. That was session number 3. But I think like I started with a negative, and because of the Bible, we have sort of 2 more negative focused sessions, and that really is what starts you off. And then you're already in that mode. So I think that's part of where that feeling is coming from. That said, I sort of hemmed and hawed before the first question about how did I choose what to include, what not to include, because as I was saying, I was like, oh, are they going to think that I like manufactured my sources to make them more positive, right? Because what I almost said, but sort of stopped myself from saying, was part of what I left out was like, there's so many negative sources about aging that if I'd really included everything, it would have felt even more negative. I was trying to actually balance it out. And I have mixed feelings about that, right? On the one hand, like the fact that these sources are not overwhelmingly negative. It's not 90-10. It's, maybe 70-30 negative to positive, or negative to positive and ambiguous. But the fact that it is sort of more leaning into the negative, like that's an important insight, right? At least for them, the negatives of aging outweighed the positives. That's not to say there were no positives. I hope we see in sessions 3 and 4 a lot of those positives. but the negative was very real. And I would say, even for us, maybe even especially for us, right? Like part of my sort of motivating sentiments in this course is like, well, now that we're sort of having our aging extend even further, right? We're able to extend life longer, but we're not really great at extending the quality of life. And so actually, maybe even more for us than for them, the negatives are more highlighted than the positives. So I think it's actually important to wrestle with that. And I don't want to sort of avoid that. And I wanted us to challenge our assumptions and sort of see some of those more positive perspectives as well. So what I tried to do actually, again, for the 3 sessions on rabbinics, was actually balance it. One session that was more negative, one that was more ambiguous, one that was more positive. But that in some ways was an unfaithful representation of what we really find in rabbinic literature, at least in terms of the numbers, right? In terms of the percentages of how much is positive and how much is negative. So I guess my final sort of defense of this would be to say that I was trying on the one hand to be faithful to these sources and show that the rabbis do ask us to wrestle with the ways in which it's really hard to get older. And I personally, as someone who has always looked young for my age and is short, like I'm starting to get my gray hairs now, and I'm like really excited about that piece, right? And like that's positive. And my digestion is bad now, and I can't eat all the things I used to eat. And again, like this is middle age, not old age, but again, for them, it seems like that might be what they're talking about. And maybe it's important to wrestle with the fact that, like, there are things that I won't be able to do again. Not that I ever could dunk a basketball, but if I could, I probably couldn't anymore, and that wouldn't come back. And I think that's, I think it's really important to wrestle with that, as much as I want to also pull out the very real moments when the rabbis are saying, but actually, there's wisdom that comes here. There's beauty that comes with old age. There is respect. There is blessing that comes in old age. And so I hope I pulled that all out. If I had to do over again, maybe I would actually change the order of things. Because I wonder if to some extent, because we started with the negative perspectives, that sort of like sets the tone, and then it's harder to sort of take ourselves out of it. So thank you everyone for the questions. I'll jump right into a little bit of closing if that's okay, Micha'el.
Go ahead.
Just to say, when I first started thinking about aging in 2012, 2013, because I was at an age where most of my friends did not have parents who were aging. My father was 48 when I was born, so I was sort of an unusual circumstance of like having an aging father when I was not yet in middle age. And it felt very lonely to be thinking about aging in this way, because my friends were not thinking about it. Their parents were not really aging yet. Their parents were in sort of upper middle age. And I'm the grandparents, obviously, but like that's a different sort of thing. People in my case, most of my grandparents passed away when I was much younger anyway. It felt very lonely, is the point. And as I've started spending more time learning, as I started doing a lot of teaching this material to prepare for this Project Zoo course, and now as I have, this Project Zoo course is out there in the world, it is gratifying is the wrong word, but there's something really, this is only going to become more of a live issue for people, like not just as individuals but as a society. Aging is just going to become a more and more bigger part of our lives, and what I hope we have here are ways to sort of think about it that challenge us out of our assumptions, right? If you are someone who's really focused on the positives, then I do hope you can lean in a little bit to the negatives and really wrestle with that. And if you're someone who's like, oh yeah, everything about aging is terrible, I really hope you can wrestle with like, oh, okay, I actually see that there are ways in which this can be a real bracha, a real blessing. So, I am excited for this Project Zoo course to live on and for folks to continue this learning. Maybe there's a sequel here about looking at more recent Jewish texts that deal with aging as well. So thank you everyone for your questions, for your excitement to do this Project Zoo course, and for helping me to feel like, I'm actually part of a community across the world of folks who are really curious about what Jewish tradition can tell us about aging. Thank you to all of you.